The classification report was short, clinical, and wrong, a few thousand lines of galactic standard text produced by analysts who had never set foot on Earth and never intended to, summarizing humanity as a low aggression, low expansion, moderate technology species with unusually high cultural noise and internal conflict, a species that talked loudly, argued constantly, and burned enormous energy arguing about symbols while quietly solving problems no one else had noticed yet, and the report ended with a designation that would later be cited in tribunal hearings and memorials as the moment everything went off the rails, non-threatening, a label that placed humans below regional powers, below mercantile enclaves, below even some nomadic scavenger fleets, a species not worth provoking and not worth fearing, which in the logic of the galaxy meant not worth watching very closely either. And that blind spot was where the trouble began, because while the council chambers rotated through their endless debates and the Empire's measured power in fleet tonnage and planetary populations, humanity was doing something unfashionable and therefore invisible. They were preparing for loss, not conquest, building systems designed to fail gracefully, networks meant to collapse inward without taking their neighbors with them, technologies that did not rely on constant expansion or external validation, and doctrines written by people who assumed that someday, somehow, everything would go wrong at once. Admiral Chen had grown up on Luna in a pressure dome that leaked twice a year, which meant she learned early that survival was not about perfection but response time, about how fast you notice a hiss before the air thinned too much, and as she stood on the command deck of the UES Resolute watching the holographic star map pulse gently with data from 100 listening arrays, she felt the same instinctive unease she used to feel as a child when the air recyclers changed. Pitch, something subtle, something most people would ignore, a flicker in the background radiation of Khepri Prime, a yellow main sequence star nearly 80 light-years from Earth, catalogued, colonized, and supposedly stable. The Resolute was not a battleship in the way the galaxy understood battleships. It carried weapons, yes, but its primary purpose was coordination, redundancy, and communication, the quiet spine of human space doctrine. And when Chen leaned forward and asked for confirmation, the bridge crew did not scramble or panic. They simply checked again, then began the slow escalation of procedures that had been rehearsed so often they felt boring, until the moment they were not, the star had dimmed by a fraction of percent, not enough to alarm a casual observer, but enough to set off alarms in systems designed by people who believed stars were things you respected like loaded guns. Dr. Luis Moreno appeared on the secondary display, his face calm in the way only someone deeply unsettled could manage. He explained that the stellar output curve was wrong, not fluctuating, not noisy, but clipped, as if something had reached into the heart of the fusion process and pinched it, which was impossible according to every known model, which meant either the models were wrong or someone had done something that should not exist. Chen ordered a priority signal routed through the deep channels, not to the Council, not to any alien authority, but inward, to Earth, to Mars, to the quiet stations between stars that rarely spoke unless something truly bad was happening. And as the signal propagated at light speed, humanity began to wake up in the way a seasoned animal wakes, without drama, without noise, but with every muscle ready. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the galaxy, the Virex Ascendancy was celebrating, their strategists watching confirmation feeds with satisfaction as Khepri Prime entered control decline. The star dimmed exactly as projected by their stellar leash technology, a weapon not meant for war in the traditional sense but for compliance. Time down a star and a system begged before it freezes. The Virex did not consider themselves cruel. They considered themselves efficient. And when the Ascendant Executive reviewed the list of affected systems, the human outposts around Khepri barely registered, a footnote in the economic impact analysis. Non-threatening species, minimal retaliation risk, acceptable collateral. Pressure. The Virex had used the leash before on species far more militarized than humans, and the galaxy had learned to accept that when stars went dark, it was because someone high on the ladder had decided it was time. The first real sign that something was different came not as an attack, but as silence, as the human colony around Khepri did not broadcast pleas or demands or frantic diplomatic requests. Instead, they executed evacuation protocols that were never filed with the Council. Fleets of small, ugly ships with oversized drives slipping out along vectors that made no strategic sense to observers trained to think in terms of borders and front lines. And when the Virex monitoring stations tried to trace them, they found nothing to lock onto, No predictable hyperspace wakes, no centralized command signals, just a dispersal pattern that looked like panic until someone bothered to map it properly, which no one did at first, because the star was still dimming and the lesson was supposed to be clear. But on Earth, in rooms without windows and titles that sounded dull by design, people were pulling ancient contingency files, protocols older than first contact, documents written when humanity still believed it might be alone, or was, might not be, and those documents all shared a single assumption, that if someone learned how to kill a star, then everything else was secondary. Trade disputes did not matter. Treaties were optional, and classification labels were meaningless, because a civilization willing to reach into the core of a sun was not negotiating, it was practicing extinction, and extinction was something humans took personally. Admiral Chen received confirmation less than an hour later that the dimming was artificial, that the energy extraction signature matched nothing in known databases, which meant it was new, or it was being hidden, and either option was bad. She authorized the release of black tier information to the network, a move that technically violated 3 separate council agreements and half a dozen human ones, but no one objected, because every person who saw the data felt the same cold realization. The galaxy had crossed a line it did not know existed, and far from the council chambers where representatives would later argue about jurisdiction and responsibility, far from the Virex command spires where celebration still echoed, humanity began to move, not in anger, not yet, but with a grim focus of a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, and its own worst impulses, a species that had never fully trusted the sky to stay friendly forever, and as Khepri Prime dimmed another fraction, the first star to go dark in living memory, the galaxy remained unaware that this was not a warning shot, not a demonstration of power, but the moment humanity stopped assuming it could be ignored. By the time the wider galaxy noticed that something was wrong, humanity had already finished arguing about it, which was always the most dangerous phase, because once humans stopped debating, they started acting, and action for them rarely looked dramatic at first. No armadas pouring out of hyperspace, no declarations broadcast in every known language, just quiet adjustments rippling through systems that outsiders barely understood existed. Deep space relays switched from passive listening to active triangulation. Civilian research arrays were folded into military oversight without ceremony, and shipyards that had been building freighters and habitat frames began subtle retooling under emergency production authorities that had not been invoked in centuries, all of it legal under human law, all of it invisible to observers who still believed the non-threatening label meant predictable. On Khepri's remaining orbital platforms, Governor Elias Okoye watched the star through reinforced viewports as its light shifted from warm yellow to something colder, weaker, a slow betrayal of physics that made his skin crawl. The evacuation was almost complete, which alone should have triggered alarms across the sector, because no species abandoned a system that fast unless they believed it was already dead. But the Virex Ascendancy Command treated the data as confirmation of success, compliance achieved, resistance minimal, lesson delivered, and when a junior analyst suggested that the human withdrawal pattern did not match any known panic response, a superior dismissed it with a flick of his frill. Humans were erratic by nature. That was practically in their file. What the Virex did not understand was that humans only look chaotic when viewed up close. Step back far enough and their behavior resolve into something colder and far more deliberate. A pattern born from centuries of planning for disasters that had not yet happened. Admiral Chen convened a secure council that did not officially exist, a distributed conference spanning light years with time dilation compensation built in, involving fleet commanders, scientists, economists, and a handful of civilians whose titles sounded unimpressive until one realized they controlled entire industrial sectors. There was no shouting, no grandstanding, just data flowing and decisions stacking neatly on top of one another. Dr. Moreno explained that the stellar leash technology appeared to siphon fusion output into an extra-dimensional sink, effectively starving the star while harvesting energy on a scale that made conventional power generation look primitive. The implication was immediate and terrifying. If the Virex could do this once, they could do it again anywhere, which meant deterrence, as the galaxy understood it was obsolete. You could not threaten a fleet if your sun could be turned off from across the void. Someone asked the obvious question, could humans replicate it? And Moreno shook his head. Not quickly, not cheaply, and not safely, which was followed by the more important question, could humans stop it? The answer was a qualified yes, but not by attacking the leash directly. The device was anchored too deeply. shielded too thoroughly. Instead, the solution involved something humans had always been uncomfortably good at, breaking systems by understanding the assumptions they relied on. The leash fed on stability, predictable fusion rates, consistent space-time metrics, and humans, with their long history of experimental physics bordering on reckless curiosity, had ideas about how to make stars behave badly in very specific ways, not explode, not collapse, but misbehave just enough to make the leash choke. The problem was that testing such solution carried risks that no civilized species would accept lightly, and that was where humanity's reputation diverged sharply from reality. Because humans did not see risk the same way the rest of the galaxy did. They had lived for generations on planets that tried to kill them with weather, tectonics, radiation, and biology. They had learned to gamble with disaster not because they enjoyed it, but because the alternative was stagnation, and stagnation, to them, was just a slower form of death. While the humans planned, the Virex escalated. Emboldened by the lack of immediate retaliation, a second system experienced minor dimming, not enough to evacuate, but enough to panic markets and remind nearby polities who held the leash. Still no human fleets appeared. Still no angry transmissions filled the council channels, and that silence began to unsettle observers who were used to humans being noisy, argumentative, and emotionally transparent. Ambassador Lena Patel remained seated in the council chamber throughout the debates, listening more than she spoke, her calm presence doing more to raise suspicion than any threat could have. When finally asked why humanity had not formally protested the stellar attack, she replied simply that protests were for misunderstandings, and this was not one. The phrase circulated widely, translated poorly into several languages, but carrying a chill even where the nuance was lost. Behind the scenes, human logistics network shifted into configurations last used during internal wars long since archived as historical curiosities. Supply chains shortened, redundancies activated, and sleeper facilities in deep space powered up, their crews blinking awake to orders that were concise and unambiguous. Observe, prepare, do not engage unless engagement is unavoidable. The galaxy mistook restraint for hesitation, a classic error. Because restraint for humans was not fear, it was discipline, and discipline was what allowed them to aim carefully on the resolute. Admiral Chen watched his predictive models converge, the math ugly but consistent. The plan would work, probably, but the margin for error was thin, the kind of thin that separated survival from annihilation. She authorized Phase 1 without ceremony. A single-coded burst sent toward Khepri at an angle no Virex sensor was optimized to monitor, carrying not a weapon but a seed, a cascade initiator designed to introduce controlled instability into the star's fusion shell, not enough to save it, but enough to change its behavior. And as the signal vanished into the dark, Chen allowed herself one quiet thought that she did not voice to anyone. The galaxy had decided stars were tools, and humans had decided long ago that anything treated like a tool could be broken. The cascade initiator reached Khepri Prime without announcement or flare, slipping through layers of space-time the way a rumor slips through a crowded room, unnoticed until it is already too late to stop. And when it activated, the star did not explode or brighten dramatically. It coughed, a subtle irregularity in its fusion rhythm that sent ripples through the stellar leash like grit and precision machinery. Alarms bloomed across Virex control arrays as energy flow spiked, dipped, then spiked. Again, not enough to trigger automatic disengagement, but enough to force manual intervention, something the Ascendancy had not anticipated needing, because their doctrine assumed stars were passive objects, obedient sources of power once properly constrained. The operators scrambled, issuing corrective commands, tightening control fields, increasing siphon strength, each response making the instability worse, because the initiator had been designed by humans who had spent centuries studying failure modes, not success cases, and who understood that complex systems rarely broke all at once. They unraveled, thread by thread. On the human side, Dr. Moreno narrated the data stream with attention that cut through the usual scientific detachment, explaining that the star was now oscillating between fusion states, safe individually but chaotic in sequence, like an engine constantly shifting gears without a clutch. The leash could not adapt fast enough, and worse, it was feeding those oscillations back into its own extra-dimensional sync, creating resonance patterns that no Virex engineer had ever modeled, because no one in the Ascendancy had ever seriously considered that someone might fight a stellar weapon without shooting at it. The first visible consequence was not destruction but confusion. Virex Command lost synchronization with peripheral leash nodes, then with internal power distribution. Systems that relied on the siphoned energy began to brown out, including defensive grids and long-range communications, which meant that when the Ascendant Executive demanded explanations, the answers arrived late, fragmented, and increasingly contradictory. Some reports claimed sabotage, others natural anomaly. Still others suggested the humans had triggered an unknown stellar pathology, a phrase that would later be mocked mercilessly in post-war analyses. But at the time it carried enough uncertainty to stall decisive action, and that hesitation was fatal, because while the Virex debated, humanity escalated to Phase 2, a move so counterintuitive that even some human planners had argued against it, until history had been reviewed and the argument settled by precedent. Phase 2 involved turning themselves back on the galaxy, not with weapons, but with transparency. Ambassador Patel addressed the Council again, this time requesting emergent secession priority, and when granted, she did not accuse or threaten. She shared data, raw, unfiltered, showing the star-dimming curves, the artificial signatures, the cascading instability now spreading through the leash network, and she framed it not as an act of war against humans, but as a threat to every civilization that orbited a star, which was all of them. The reaction was immediate and volatile. Delegations erupted, alliances frayed, and species that had tolerated the Virex out of fear or convenience suddenly saw their own suns reflected in the data. So how easily levers could become annihilation. The Virex protested, accused humanity of reckless endangerment, of destabilizing a stellar body, and Patel agreed calmly, stating that destabilization was already underway. Humanity had simply chosen to fight it in the only arena that mattered, physics, not politics. Behind the scenes, human fleets still did not move in the traditional sense. Instead, influence propagated through markets, insurance networks, and shared infrastructure protocols. Human-owned shipping companies rerouted around Virex space, citing safety concerns. Human insurers voided coverage for systems under stellar manipulation risk, and human engineers quietly published papers detailing theoretical counters to energy siphon technologies, just enough to make them plausible without revealing the classified core. The galaxy began to shift, not because humanity demanded it, but because interacting with the Virex suddenly carried unacceptable risk, and risk, unlike ideology, was universally understood. At Khepri Prime, the star's light flickered, then stabilized at a new equilibrium, dimmer than before but no longer declining. The leash struggled, overcorrected, and finally shut down to prevent catastrophic feedback into Virex core systems, a failsafe that saved their infrastructure but surrendered the demonstration of power they had relied on. The first star did not die, but it did go dark in a different way. No longer a symbol of Virex dominance, but of its limits, and when that realization spread, the non-threatening label attached to humanity began to unravel, replaced not by fear yet, but by something far more dangerous to the established order, respect mixed with uncertainty, because the galaxy had just watched a species classified as harmless reach into the heart of a star without destroying it and force an empire to blink. The Virex Ascendancy did not collapse in outrage or rage as many had expected. Instead, it did something far more unsettling. It recalculated. And for a civilization built on control and projection of inevitability, recalculation was an admission of vulnerability they had not made in millennia. Internal communiques shifted tone from punitive to defensive. Fleets previously positioned for coercive demonstrations were recalled to protect leash infrastructure, and for the first time since their rise, the Ascendancy began quietly auditing its own assumptions, particularly the one that said no species would dare interfere with a stellar weapon without first being broken by it. That assumption died quietly in the data vault as analysts replayed the Khepri incident frame by frame, noting with growing discomfort how human responses had anticipated Virex countermeasures almost before they were issued, as if the humans had not reacted to the leash but expected it, which in a way they had. Because on Earth, old strategic schools had always treated the destruction of environments as a first resort of a desperate or arrogant power, and stars were simply environments scaled up. Admiral Chen did not celebrate the stabilization of Khepri Prime. She marked it as a checkpoint, not a victory, because the leash still existed, and the galaxy had now learned that stars could be fought over without fleets ever meeting. A lesson that would not be unlearned. Human planners accelerated the third phase, which involved something that made even allies uneasy, deliberate exposure of human vulnerability. Chen authorized limited releases showing how close the cascade initiator had come to triggering uncontrolled stellar behavior, how narrow the margins truly were, and how badly things could have gone if the math had been off by a fraction. The message was not we are invincible, but this is what it costs to fight this way, and we are willing to pay it, a subtle but profound signal to anyone considering escalation, because the Terrence was not about appearing strong. It was about appearing irrational enough to follow through. On the council floor, reactions diverged sharply. Some species praised humanity's restraint and ingenuity. Others accused them of playing dice with shared reality, and a few quietly updated their threat assessments, noting that humans did not optimize for dominance but for survivability under worst-case scenarios, a trait that made them uniquely dangerous. When cornered, the Virex attempted to regain narrative control by proposing a multilateral framework for stellar manipulation oversight, a move that would have been laughed out of the chamber weeks earlier but now received cautious consideration. Ambassador Patel responded with conditional interest, emphasizing that any framework must begin with full disclosure of leash capabilities and limitations, something the Ascendancy had never shared with anyone, and that was a real battlefield now. Transparency versus secrecy, because a leash power depended not just on physics but on ignorance. Meanwhile, human activity continued in places no one thought to watch. Small teams embedded in alien research institutions under long-standing exchange agreements began asking very pointed questions about stellar dynamics, failure cascades, and energy extraction ethics, always politely, always within the rules, planting intellectual seeds that would later grow into resistance against unilateral star control. The galaxy began to fracture along new lines, not human versus alien, but those who believed stars were tools and those who believed there were boundaries no one should cross lightly, and humanity found itself, unintentionally but irrevocably, at the center of that divide, not as conquerors or saviors, but as proof that the old hierarchies were brittle, that power built on single points of failure could be challenged by a species willing to think sideways and accept terrifying risks. As Khepri Prime slowly recovered, its light still scarred but steady, the phrase first star went dark took on a layered meaning across the galaxy. It was no longer just about dimming photons, but about the moment certainty failed, the moment an empire learned that classification labels could be wrong, catastrophically so, and in quiet rooms across human space, planners began preparing for the inevitable next move, because if there was one thing history had taught them, it was that no one forgives a species that teaches a galaxy a new way to fight. The inevitable next move came not as another dim star, but as a probe, a careful, deniable test designed to map humanity's true limits, because the Virex Ascendancy understood brute force had failed, but information warfare still had teeth. So they deployed a ghost fleet, vessels stripped of identifiable signatures and crewed by semi-autonomous systems, toward the periphery of human space, not to attack but to observe reactions, response times, command hierarchies, and internal coordination. Under ambiguous threat, a classic escalation tactic that had unraveled lesser powers countless times, but humans noticed almost immediately, not because the Ghost Fleet was sloppy, but because human space was riddled with sensors no one else bothered to build, redundant civilian-grade instruments designed for asteroid mining, weather prediction, and scientific curiosity, all quietly feeding into a mesh that flagged anomalies without asking permission. Admiral Chen reviewed the data with tired familiarity. The shapes were wrong, the trajectories too clean, the silence too intentional, and instead of dispatching warships, she ordered traffic. Thousands of civilian craft rerouted through the Ghost Fleet's path, merchant convoys, research vessels, habitat tugs, each broadcasting mundane, irritatingly human chatter, cluttering the sensor picture until the observing algorithms began to struggle. Then she layered noise on top of noise, false maintenance beacons, outdated transponder codes, fragments of old cultural broadcasts that meant nothing but fill bandwidth, drowning the Ghost Fleet in context it could not interpret. And when the Virex analysts finally realized what were happening, they faced a deeply uncomfortable truth. Humanity did not separate civilian and military space the way everyone else did. It braided them, making any observation also an act of risk, because to see clearly you had to look through lives you might shatter by acting. The probe withdrew. Data, Incomplete and confidence shaken, and the report it generated circulated through Ascendancy Command with an unspoken conclusion. Humans were not hiding behind civilians. They had simply built a civilization where defense was collective property, messy, inefficient, and brutally resilient. Elsewhere, smaller powers took note. Species that had lived under the shadow of stellar leashes and economic coercion began reaching out to human diplomats with questions framed as academic but heavy with implication. What happens if a star is threatened? What preparations are reasonable? What lines should never be crossed? And humans answered carefully, never offering weapons or blueprints, only principles: decentralize, diversify, never trust a single point of failure, assume the worst day will come, and prepare to survive it. These ideas spread faster than any fleet, and with them spread unease, because the galaxy had been built on specialization and hierarchy, on the belief that stability came from control, and now a species labeled non-threatening was quietly undermining that foundation by example alone. The Virex tried once more to reassert dominance, this time economically, leveraging trade dependencies and energy markets to isolate human systems. But the effort faltered as partners discovered how deeply human infrastructure was interwoven into their own. Cutting humans out meant cutting themselves. And for the first time, the Ascendancy encountered a target that could not be cleanly separated from the environment around it. As months passed, the memory of Khepri did not fade. It hardened into doctrine. Stars were no longer assumed safe. Empires began fortifying suns away their once fortified borders, and the cost of maintaining dominance skyrocketed, draining the very advantages that had kept powers like the Virex on top. On Earth, Chen watched these developments with mixed relief and dread. Humanity had not won, but it had changed the game, and changing the game was often more dangerous than winning it, because now everyone was learning new rules at once, and somewhere, in some dark corner of the galaxy, someone would decide to test them again. But when that day came, the galaxy would remember the first star that went dark, and the quiet species that taught everyone why that mattered. By the time the test came, it no longer looked like a Virex problem at all, which was exactly why it was so dangerous, because the galaxy had absorbed the lesson of Khepri unevenly. Some learned caution, others learned desperation, and one mid-tier coalition known as the Sorynth Compact learned envy. They lacked stellar leash technology but possessed something almost as destabilizing, a fanatical belief that humanity had stolen the future from them by proving empires could be challenged without overwhelming force. So they sought to recreate that moment on their own terms, not by dimming a star, but by forcing humans into a dilemma that would fracture their carefully cultivated image. The Compact announced a humanitarian intervention near a red dwarf system bordering human trade lanes, claiming an internal rebellion required containment. And when human observers detected anomalous energy reading consistent with protostellar interference experiments, the trap became clear. The Sorynth were not trying to control the star. They were trying to break it, slowly, sloppily, in a way that would poison half a sector if it went critical, daring humanity to intervene, because intervention would mean crossing sovereign space and validating every accusation a human overreach whispered since Khepri. Admiral Chen's council reconvened under heavier silence than before. The math was unforgiving. Doing nothing meant billions dead over decades as radiation and gravitational disruption rippled outward. Acting meant becoming exactly what their enemies claimed, a power that decided which stars lived and died. And for a long moment, no one spoke, until Governor Okoye, now relocated but still carrying the gravity of Khepri in his voice, said a thing no strategist wanted to say out loud. If we let this happen to protect our image, then the image is already a lie. The decision followed, not unanimous, but firm. Humanity would intervene openly, not with weapons, but with presence. Human fleets entered Sorynth space, broadcasting every sensor feed in real time to the Council, inviting observers, critics, and rivals alike to watch what they did and how they did it. Engineers worked under constant scrutiny, stabilizing the star using techniques adapted from the Khepri cascade, slower, safer, painfully cautious. And when Sorynth forces moved to interfere, human ships did not fire, they interposed, absorbing damage meant for reactors and habitats, recording everything. Casualties mounted, not catastrophic, but real, and that mattered. Because for the first time since the classification era, the galaxy saw humans bleed without retaliation, saw them accept loss to prevent a greater one. The Sorynth Compact collapsed politically within weeks, their leaders exposed not as liberators but as gamblers willing to burn a system to regain relevance. Sanctions followed, not driven by human pressure but by collective outrage, and in the aftermath, something subtle shifted. Humanity was no longer discussed as non-threatening or even dangerous, but as costly to oppose, not because of fleets or weapons, but because opposing them meant standing on the wrong side of survival itself. Chen resigned her command shortly after, citing exhaustion and the need for new voices. History would remember her not as a conqueror but as a coordinator, someone who understood that in a galaxy of brittle giants, the species that endured would be the one that refused to let single points of failure decide fate. The galaxy did not mark the end of the crisis with a treaty or a proclamation, because there was nothing clean left to sign, only a slow, collective adjustment to a reality that no longer fit the old charts. Stars were reclassified from assets to responsibilities. Empires quietly dismantled doctrines built on coercive astrophysics, and the phrase non-threatening disappeared from classification databases, not replaced with hostile or dominant, but with something far more unsettling too: bureaucratic minds, unpredictable under existential pressure, which was as close as a galaxy ever came to admitting fear. Humanity did not expand its borders or claim new systems in the aftermath. Instead, it did something profoundly human and deeply confusing to outsiders. It went home. Resources were poured into hardening existing worlds, diversifying habitats, and building knowledge archives meant to survive civilizational collapse, not to prevent it, but to endure it. Admiral Chen faded into history lectures and quiet interviews. Okoye returned to governance. Patel remained at the council long enough to help draft the stellar non-interference accords before stepping aside, and life went on in the messy, loud, argumentative way it always had for humans. But something fundamental had changed. The night sky was no longer assumed safe by anyone, and that caution reshaped the balance of power more effectively than any war. The first star that went dark became a reference point, taught in academies across species, not as a moment humanity rose, but as a moment the galaxy realized it had been playing with the foundations of existence, and that one underestimated species had been ready for that truth all along. Because humans had never believed the universe owed them stability, they had only ever asked for enough time to respond when it failed. And in that acceptance, that stubborn refusal to trust permanence, they found their real strength, not in dominating the stars, but in reminding everyone else that some lines, once crossed, would change everything forever.